Hello and welcome to another edition of In the Trenches podcast. I'm your host, Seth, and today we have a very special guest. His name is Dr. Ronald Pestritto. He is a graduate dean and professor of politics at Hillsdale College, where he teaches political philosophy, American political thought, and American politics. He is also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy, and he is an academic fellow of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He has written 8 books, including his newest book, America Transformed: The Rise and the Legacy of the American Progressivism. Mr. Pestritto, thank you for coming on our program.
Happy to be here.
So let's start with the title of your book. You called it America Transformed: The Rise and Legacy of American Progressivism. I noticed you didn't say, the crisis of America or anything like that. You kind of took a more gloomy, I would guess, look about America, saying that it has transformed. So I guess I kind of wonder, why are you so gloomy? If you don't mind me asking.
Yeah, no, I don't mind you asking at all. It's funny. I consider myself somewhat more optimistic than some of my conservative friends. So, I think there's actually a lot of, I guess the kids call it being black pilled, if I'm using that expression correctly. I always have to get my pill language right, but I think there's actually a lot of that in the conservative movement, and a lot of despair about the state of the country, and sort of wondering if there's a way to bring it back. So I would say 2 things about that. I mean, the title I chose, America Transformed, as if, past tense, it's happened. And I think that that's hard to argue against for reasons we can get into. I do in the postscript to the book, I do leave it as an open question. Sort of what I try to leave readers with is to say, look, the country is as divided today, in my opinion, as it was in the 1850s. That's the only kind of parallel time I can think of where essentially you have adherence to 2 different regimes, sort of the culture of 2 different regimes, the principles of 2 different opposing regimes, these positions held by people, citizens of the same country, and that it's been going on for a long time. The progressive era, came to the fore around the turn of the 20th century, and so this uneasy coexistence has now become much more obvious to everybody. And I think the reason for that is because what the progressives put in place over a century ago has finally taken hold and is finally paying dividends for them. And so, I think it's hard to argue against the fact that the major political and cultural institutions have by and large been transformed. Certainly our national institutions, the scope of government, what we expect from government, but not only in politics, but in culture, the institutions of the media, certainly the university, which is my domain, although at Hillsdale, I'm privileged to be at a place that's kind of an exception to that. But the institutions as they were, I think they're gone by and large. Doesn't mean they're gone irretrievably. And I leave it as an open question at the end of the book. I say the elections of our time. This is why the elections today have become so contentious. Not that elections are contentious generally, but I think become so contentious of late because people see that we're kind of reached a point where there's going to be a direction that's decided. And I think that's what's at stake right now. And I think everybody or many people understand that.
So, you just talked about progressivism, the progressive era, and the subtitle of your book is called "The Rise and Legacy of American Progressivism." Just for the benefit of our listeners, I was wondering what you can tell us about what progressivism is, and uh, uh, and how it has, uh, you know, come so far, I guess, today.
Sure. I mean, the long answer to that is the book itself. I mean, you've in a way asked me to give the thesis and the narrative of the book, but the short version is I always like to think of progressivism as an argument to move beyond the principles of the original American order, the constitutional order. That's the argument of the progressives. They argue that the circumstances that they face, the circumstances that are pressing upon the American people at the time they're writing, were such that they could not have been envisioned by the founders. That's no slight on the founders. That's just the times have gotten away from them and their vision for government. And so as a result of that, it's time for new principles. And it wasn't just an argument that the means of government, that the practicalities of government have to change, because certainly the founders themselves understood that full well. They certainly did not think that their exact model was going to be fixed in time. They make the argument themselves in many places, including the Federalist Papers, that their own model was based upon the historical improvements to the science of politics. And so they expect that to continue. There's an amendment process in the Constitution for exactly that reason. But that's not what the progressives are talking about. They're not talking about mere changes in means. They're talking about changes in ends. They think that there's an understanding of human nature that undergirded the original Constitution, that led it to be focused on the rights that human beings have by nature that precede government, and thus government's always obligated first and foremost to attend to those rights and to secure those rights. And they knew that that was an obstacle to their vision for government. And so it's why so many of the works that I talk about in my book begin with a kind of dismantling by progressive intellectuals of the original political theory of the American founding, the social compact theory, the idea of natural rights. And that's progressivism is an argument for new principles, new foundations, a new view of the human person, not just new policies or new mechanisms of government.
So my question is, because as I'm reading through the book, it's a very obscure kind of I don't know, theory or philosophy. Um and it's kind of weird to see this obscure thing to become so mainstream. Um and I kind of wonder, how did that happen? How did this sort of academic, very academic it seems like, philosophy become so mainstream? Can you
Yeah,
can
I mean, in one sense, I would say you're right. It has its origins in academia, and its origins are foreign, and the progressives themselves admit this. But in another way, I think it's really not so obscure. It actually sort of draws from a very natural kind of disposition, one might say, in human nature, which is the idea of just sort of keeping up with the times, of always being on the move, that as problems present themselves, you adjust accordingly, and the idea of progress, that we're always forward looking, that things are getting better, that our best days are in front of us. These are very, very common sayings one hears all the time in politics, and it's one of the reasons why the label progressive today is so it's the label that the left has latched onto. It's because they think it's a politically attractive label. Who's against progress? Who wouldn't? What's the opposite of being a progressive? I suppose one might ask, right? So in that sense, it's a perfectly natural, and a lot of defenders of the progressives, a lot of those, for example, in the discipline of history, who study the American progressives, simply see progressivism as a very natural reaction of statesmen to the very different and changing and hard circumstances of their times. And it's a natural outgrowth, that there's a kind of continuity or a natural movement out from government in the 19th century. And in that sense, not so obscure. My argument is that all that is quite correct, but that you have to deal with it imported into the country in the second half of the 19th century, these very foreign ideas, that you have a rejection of the original ideas of American natural rights, social compact, limited government. Human nature is something that is both makes us capable of popular government, but also has its more depraved side. And so one always has to check the power, even of a democratic majority. And there's an assault on that idea from the philosophy of historicism, which the progressives were educated in. They learned it, most of them in Germany. They brought it into the American universities. Really is the story of practically how it came into the United States. The institutions of higher education in this country, which used to be small kind of religious colleges, were transformed in the second half of the 19th century as they sought to become elite. And one did that by bringing in these sort of European educated PhDs. And that was a lot of German influence that came that way, and a political philosophy which had come up on the continent very much opposed to the idea of natural rights, which undergirded the American Constitution. It doesn't mean that there weren't receptive elements here in our own native political culture. It takes two to tango, and history is complicated that way. There are lots of different factors that bring these things about. But it really was, in a way, a sort of deliberate transformation of ideas starting in the universities.
You mentioned historicism, and maybe some of our listeners might don't know what it is. I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about historicism and why, and give the definition and why it's so contradictory to the natural rights philosophy.
Sure. I mean, again, I'll sort of generalize here. There are lots of different versions of it and different thinkers, but with that caveat, I mean, just to say, it's the proposition that it really is not possible to speak of just government or of truth in any sort of absolute terms. That discussion is always contingent on something else, right? So what might be just government in one age would be different in a different age. What truth means in one age is different in a different age. That history affects our notions of justice, truth, religion, all of that. And so you cannot speak, as the American founders spoke in the Declaration of Independence, of certain ends of government that were true for all men at all times. Right? This is the argument of Jefferson, who drafted the Declaration, and Abraham Lincoln, as many of your listeners may know, has a very, very famous speech reflecting back on Jefferson and the Declaration, where he says, that's the unique thing about the founding, is they took this particular historical conflict and used it to reflect ideas that they believe transcended historical change. And so while circumstances change, the founders believed human nature doesn't change. Human nature is a constant. We learn more about government. We have improved means of government. That's certainly true. But human nature is a constant, and the ends of government, the basic purpose of government, remains constant throughout historical change. And that was an idea that was opposed by the progressives because it kept the Constitution limited, and it meant government was always considered to be a sort of limited instrument. You could only do so much with it. And real historicism, and this gets into the weeds a little bit, but real historicism also has a kind of idealistic element to it, because the argument of some historicists, certainly those who influenced the American progressives, was not only that notions of truth kind of adjust to fit history, but that the adjustment is always in a positive direction. That history is brings change, but it's not random change. Change is going somewhere. It's going to some ideal end, some utopia. And so progressivism in this sense is built on a philosophy that was very influential in some of the more utopian ideologies of the 19th and 20th century.
Yeah, and this is something. I mean, the problem with historicism and the especially what you were just saying about the ideal, um, I don't know, idea of historicism is that uh, history isn't just one way, doesn't go one way. That is, history doesn't just I don't know, improve, over time, as I'm, I'm thinking during the progressive era, um, there was, eugenics came around and science really became sort of a thing in the progressive era. And what came out of it was this sort of pernicious doctrine of eugenics and such. And so I guess I kind of wonder, what did 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 the progressives really not see the bad side of historicism and what it could bring about, and that sort of stuff, or were they just naive in a way?
Well, partly we have the benefit of historical hindsight that many of them did not have. I mean, the lessons that you're talking about are by and large lessons learned, or at least lessons that should have been learned in the 20th century, right? This is where you see the sort of obvious consequences. So you have historicism, you have the historical idealism emerging out of these philosophies in the 19th century, the Hegels and the Marxes and so on. But they really take full flower in political regimes and actual political regimes in the first half of the 20th century. And so, in a way, the progressives are part of the first generation of bringing this utopian ideology to bear uh, on real political life. And so, it's I mean, I think you have to understand the power of it too, right? How because if one claims to know the result of history, if one claims to know where history is going, then anyone on the other side, anyone in one's way, is in a way a sort of not just an opponent, but standing against the tide of history, standing against the will of God or the movement of spirit, and all kinds of nasty little things can be justified in light of their higher historical utility, right? So you may need, certain things done. Referring to Marx, for instance, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, but only because you know that further down the historical road there's the stateless utopia, and this is all in the service of that higher historical utility. As the great historist philosopher Hegel puts it in his philosophy of history, he says, many a delicate flower must be crushed to pieces in the path of the world spirit. And so, but it's not something we really see take its full effect until the 20th century. One thing to be clear about, I certainly would not argue that the progressives that I am writing about are these sort of kinds of moral monsters
Right.
that we have in some of these totalitarian regimes. That's not the case at all. And one has to be very careful about that. But that there's an ideology here that if it goes a certain direction, becomes very dangerous.
Yeah, I don't think reading your book, I don't think for clarification's sake, I don't think you said that, but um,
Right. Yeah, I always make sure to make sure people understand that point.
but I think I want to talk a little bit about Oliver Wendell Holmes because I think he's sort of the avatar for progressive era, um, uh, not just of that age, but also progressive jurisprudence. And he talked a lot about um, you know history, looking to history and science, so to speak, and what we're talking about. And I was just wondering, what made this so appealing, this idea of history and science, and we can use it not just in government, but also in the courts and stuff. And I was wondering with that, as part of that, you know, can you tell us what made this so such a problem today? This sort of thinking, this sort of jurisprudence of looking to history and science, and how it has transformed America today.
Well, let me take that. Let me try to take that in two pieces. In terms of the appeal of science, I think that's, you have to remember the 19th century is the century of the advent of evolution and the so-called Darwinian revolution. Although much gets attributed to Darwin, that's not from Darwin, that was around well before Darwin, but he becomes a kind of symbol of evolution and brings about a kind of confidence in science that then sort of feeds down into lots of different elements of political thought and religion and so forth and so on. With respect to jurisprudence, I mean, it's interesting you bring up Holmes. Holmes is an interesting. I wouldn't call Holmes a progressive straightforwardly. Holmes is on the court during the progressive era. He is appointed, of course, by progressive president Theodore Roosevelt. And his role on the court is often to side with the defense of progressive legislation. But I don't know that Holmes has quite the sort of hardcore utopianism that many progressives have. So Holmes, for example, I would say Holmes is more along the lines of a kind of legal positivist who would say that the idea that there are permanent principles which sort of are fundamental, which are more important than ordinary law, that's what he's very skeptical of. And so he has a famous essay on the natural law, which the natural law was a foundational principle for the American regime. The idea that human nature is permanent, that certain truths come out of it, that government can't transgress it, even when it's maybe powered by a majority, right? And Holmes resisted that very much. He didn't think there were any permanent theories or permanent truths, and certainly not thought that as a matter of jurisprudence, one shouldn't read the law or read the Constitution to sort of reflect permanent principles of natural law. He was very much a skeptic, and so, for example, his probably his most famous dissent on the court was in the Lochner v. New York case. This was a case, many of your listeners probably know it. This is a case where the state of New York had passed regulations on contract, in particular on the number of hours one could agree to work in a bakery. And the Supreme Court struck this down. And it said this is a violation of certain core theories of property and contract that undergird the Constitution. And Holmes didn't like that. Holmes dissented very famously and said, look, you can't take these principles from the founding and sort of read them into to the law today. That truth basically is contingent on time, is contingent on people's perspective on history. And so during his time on the court, Holmes, who was usually on the losing side on these questions, Holmes was he didn't want courts upholding a theory of constitutional government as over against what progressive majorities wanted to enact. And so certainly he was an ally of the progressives, fellow traveler, but maybe not quite who knows? But I don't think quite a progressive in the way that, say, some of the other progressive intellectuals were.
I'm a little surprised by that, because it seems to me like he definitely, at least some of my reading, he seemed to take some of the principles of the progressives, like looking to science and history and some of that, and implement it in in his own jurisprudence. It made me think of what he said about Buck versus Bell,
Sure.
and kind of using some of the more progressive ideas. Um, I was wondering though, his ideas seem to be though this sort of living constitutionalism and such, that he's supporting and
Very,
support.
very much so. I think that's right. I think when you put him in the living constitution camp, I think that's very accurate.
Which I think is the ascendant view of today. Um, I was wondering just how that has wreaked havoc, and how that has, I guess, helped the progressive agenda to today. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, the idea of a living constitution, and in this sense, I mean, Holmes is very much in lockstep with the progressives. The idea of a living constitution is basically says that the Constitution cannot be interpreted as it was written or as it was intended, because it was written during a very different time and written for circumstances that are long passed by. And so how we judges, Holmes would say, how we judges ought to act today, and when we interpret, is to try to update it, try to take things that are in the Constitution and define them in accord with our times, not in accord with the original intent or original meaning. There are a lot of disputes about originalism, and there are lots of forms of it on the right today, of course. And I'm not an expert on that. I don't want to. People would sort of get picky about these terms, but by and large, that's the difference between the originalism and the living constitution view. And it's very congenial to progressivism, because what progressives wanted to do with government simply did not fit and did not comport with the original principles of constitutional government. I mean, and they knew that. I'm not saying anything that they themselves didn't say openly and directly. They knew what they were doing was different. They knew what they were doing was a departure. And so this idea of a living constitution was a way for them to continue to be able to claim fidelity to the Constitution, essentially by being able to define it to mean whatever it is they needed it to mean in order to do what they wanted to do. They didn't much like the idea of a written constitution, by the way. So say somebody like Woodrow Wilson, for example, I wrote an earlier book about. Wilson was an Anglophile. His ideal model was the British parliamentary system, where the Constitution is literally a living constitution. There is no written document. It is a kind of collection, an evolving tradition of precedences that are sort of laid down but adjust over time. And to Wilson, that's far superior to a written document. And that phrase, living constitution, it comes from the progressive era. Certainly Holmes subscribed to it. And what it meant for him was that the principles of government, the principles of truth itself, were contingent on circumstance, contingent on history, and jurisprudence had to reflect that.
And I mean, of course, the court has changed a lot since Trump has been in office, and the court is I guess of different makeup. But it seems like even today, um, there are still adherents to this idea of a living constitution, and um, I I mean, recently I think we saw even from Gorsuch this sort of what living originalism, constitutionalism of trying to, I think, merge those two together in the Bostock case recently. But it seems like this philosophy of using the living constitutionalism for progressive ends isn't going away anytime soon.
No, I think you're correct about that, and I think you're also correct to suggest, if I understand you properly, that it's not necessarily an idea that doesn't have its adherents on the right. And the most obvious example, by the way, of a you know a conservative jurist who embraced the philosophy of the living constitution of Oliver Wendell Holmes was late Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who actually writes about this, and he writes praising Holmes and praising Holmes' view of the living constitution. Rehnquist did that at the time to defend legislative superiority as over against the court that he was on, which is the Warren era court. And so Rehnquist was witness to his fellow judges essentially coming in and overturning a lot of legislation which he believed reflected the majority sentiment, and the Warren court was very activist in striking it down on the basis of what they said was constitutional principle, highly questionable argumentation in my view, but nonetheless. And so Rehnquist said that our champion should be Oliver Wendell Holmes. Holmes was all for letting the legislature do what it wanted. Holmes didn't want constitutional principle, alleged constitutional principle, to get in the way of current majorities enacting the legislation that they preferred. And so you do see that on the right. There's a long history of that.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, even Scalia, I think, to some degree, also at least reached, not, I wouldn't say living constitutionalism, but he definitely was a legal positivist.
That's right, and I think that's what they got most from Holmes. I would not want to be understood as sort of putting Justice Scalia or even Justice Rehnquist in the camp of a William Brennan or a Harry Blackmun who say, well, the Constitution just has to evolve and mean whatever we think it means. That was absolutely not their argument. But they thought, I believe it's the case, that they thought that legal positivism, that basically saying, look, we're just going to stick to the black letter law. We're not the thing that Rehnquist liked about Holmes is Holmes rejected the idea that there's this idea of natural law to the Constitution and that one has to read it in light of that. That's Rehnquist said, no, the Constitution is good because the people voted for it. And if they voted for something different, then that different thing would be good. And that Rehnquist at the time thought there was safety in that because at the time it was the left on the courts, in the 60s and 70s, that was turning to sort of highfalutin principle to impose its vision of justice on what he thought was the majority of the country.
Yeah, and it's certainly, I do think this still is the ascendant sort of, view or the more prominent view of the court today. Just as a final sort of question is, do you have any idea of how to push back, not just against this legal positivism and living constitutionalism, which the progressivism has promoted, but just in general of how to push back so that we can reclaim some, the social contract theory, the idea that all men are created equal. Just if you do have any idea of how to reclaim that, just tell us your thoughts there.
Sure. I mean, if I had a really effective idea, I'd be much more famous and wealthy, I suppose, than I am. But I mean, I think you did put your finger on an important phrase, right? Because on the one hand, so many of our institutions have been undermined at this point, and the left is now open in its in going all out for transforming the country. And we've just been through the 4th of July here, which just remarkably, one couldn't have even imagined it a few years ago. Just denunciations of the Declaration of Independence, of our first principles, were commonplace, and it was just striking. Now, when you have denunciations of the Declaration of Independence, well, what's in the Declaration of Independence? Among other things, that statement that all men are created equal. And I think we have such a democratic culture these days, a small d democratic culture, But rhetorically, that's a point to start with, right? To emphasize that what the left is arguing for is inequality, that they're arguing against equal treatment under the law, that they're arguing against treating people equally regardless of their race, their national origin, what have you. I think that's probably the most effective way to just, and these things become obvious to people the more that we talk about them. Now, this is going to be a very difficult fight because our institutions have been corrupted root and branch by now. But I think that rhetorically, that's the best thing we can hang our hat on. And I always say the hope, one great hope for us is the overreach of the left, and I think there's a lot of that going on right now.
Yeah, I think as far as overreach, the left's overreach, I think there's a lot of that going on. I think they bit off more they can chew with the CRT stuff and how, critical race theory, in other words, and how that really goes against the founding principles, and especially on the idea that all men are created equal under the law and all that stuff. I think you're correct there. I hope what people get from this book is that, not only see the pernicious doctrine of progressivism, but hopefully that, they look to the ideas of the founders in the Declaration to try and reclaim, our country again from this, this pernicious doctrine.
Well, I hope you're right, and I think the door has been open for us. I mean, really, just in the last few days, to see, the open denunciation of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of our country, which on the one hand is a natural outgrowth of what progressives have been saying for a long time, but just to see it so open, it's very jarring, and hopefully will be jarring to many. And be cause for some reexamination. We'll see.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll definitely see. Well, Dr. Pestritto, it's been a wonderful time, talking with you. I hope we have you back on again. I know you weren't a scholar of Oliver Wendell Holmes, but you're definitely someone who at least knows about the progressive era, and we wanted someone who can probably talk about both. And so I think your book came at the right time for us to talk about it. We appreciate you coming on our show.
Well, thanks for having me, and I enjoyed it, and happy to come on again.
Awesome. All right, signing off from In the Trenches.